Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I've got a fun video today. We're going to talk about my favorite tiny handhelds. Now you can find these devices in any shape or size, all the way up to like as large as a Steam Deck, and then all the way down to something that is almost unplayably small. In this video, we're going to focus on those smaller handhelds, not necessarily because they're better than the others, but because they're more pocketable and portable. And I've always found that the easier a device is to take around, the more likely I'm going to grab it, and the more likely I'm going to play it as well. And so even though these may not be the best handhelds in the world, they end up being the ones that I play the most. Anyway, in this video, we're going to break down my 5 favorite, and all of these can be found for under $100. In fact, 4 of the 5 can be found for under $50. And so grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start by talking about some ground rules, what specifically I mean by a tiny handheld and what works and what doesn't. And the number one thing for me is that the handheld has to be very easily pocketable. So for example, if you're somebody who has a real job where you wear those fancy clothes that have like a front pocket on them, then I would expect the handheld to be able to slide inside of that. In other words, I think of these retro handhelds as everyday carry devices. So for example, when you're grabbing your wallet and your keys, you're about ready to step out of the house, you can also grab this handheld at the same time. And to be clear, unless you are specifically only looking for a small handheld like this, I don't really consider these to be a primary retro handheld. There are plenty of other devices that I think are a lot better than these, but they are larger, to the point where I wouldn't find them to be as easily pocketable. And 3 really good examples in that front are going to be 3.5-inch devices, including the Miyoo Mini Plus, the Anbernic RG28XX, as well as the RG35XX SP. All 3 of these devices are amazing. They have 480p displays that are 3.5 inches, and they also have Wi-Fi and are just very comfortable in their own way. In fact, the clamshell one, which is the SP right here, this one is easily one of my favorite handhelds of the year. And so if we're only talking about a primary retro handheld, something that is just going to work both at home and on the go, then I think these are still a really excellent solution. But in terms of ultra portability, I wouldn't consider these to be tiny handhelds like we're talking about here today. Now, along the same lines of devices that are just a little bit too big to be tiny, there are also other devices that have the word mini or micro in them that I wouldn't consider to be on this list either. These are going to be premium devices that are amazingly small for what they can do, but not to the point of being tiny. And we have 2 very recent examples that I just reviewed over the past few weeks, including the Neo Pocket Micro and then also the Retroid Pocket Mini. And if you haven't seen those videos yet, I'll leave them linked down below, but these are amazing devices. They can perform all the way up to playing like GameCube and PS2 games. That's crazy. But I don't find them to be as easily pocketable and portable as the 3.5-inch devices that we were just talking about, as well as the tiny devices that are going to be on this list. So obviously there are handhelds like those that are bigger than tiny, but there are also some that are a little bit too small for comfort as well. Let's start with the Funkey S. This is an amazing little clamshell handheld. This costs around $75 and is just kind of a marvel that something so small can play up to most PS1 games. I also love this clamshell form factor. You can just snap it shut, it'll turn it off and save your game. In addition, the custom firmware on here is just about perfect. It's super snappy and really lightweight. And even though I think this is a wonderful little novelty, I don't find myself using it in the day-to-day. And there are 2 main reasons for that. The first is that we have a 1-inch screen on it, which is just really squinty. In addition, the controls themselves are very small, so you can't really do any serious gaming on it either. But if you're really tight on space and you only really need it for like one-handed role-playing games, then yes, this could definitely work. Another similar device that I also find to be too small is the Anbernic RG Nano. This one costs around $50 and is basically a clone of the Funkey S. It has the same size screen and runs a very similar software, but it does come in a vertical form factor and it's made out of metal as well. And so again, this is one that I would categorize as being in the novelty space, and it's a really neat little handheld, especially if you just load it up with like a single Game Boy Color game. It can be a nice focused experience, but not really what we're going for here in this video. And then finally, one other handheld that I consider to be too small but might be worth your consideration is the TrimUI Model S. This one is also known as the Powkiddy A66. It's going to be the same handheld and it's going to cost around $35. Now this one's claim to fame is that it's basically the size of like a credit card, but a little bit thicker. And so I do love how slim and pocketable this one is as well. You can definitely throw it in that front pocket. And the reason why this one didn't quite make it onto my list is again because of that smaller screen. So this one's only 2 inches and the resolution on this is fairly low as well, and so the scaling on it just doesn't look that great. And so this one is just on the cusp of being a little bit too small for my tastes, but I did want to give it a shout out either way. So at this point, we've kind of established what our Goldilocks range is when it comes to a tiny handheld. I want something that has a screen larger than 2 inches, but not all the way up to 3.5. And so all the devices that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this video are going to be somewhere between like 2.4 and 2.8 inches in terms of screen size. So let's go ahead and start breaking them down. I'm going to rank them in my top 5, going from 5 to 1, and then also 1 honorable mention. And so let's start with the honorable mention first. That's going to be the Anbernic RG28XX. This one goes for about $50 and has a 2.8-inch screen with a 480p resolution. Like with all the other handhelds that we're going to be talking about in this video, I have full in-depth reviews. I'll leave it all linked down below. But for each of these devices, I'm going to talk about my 3 favorite things and 3 least favorite things about them, because none of these are perfect. So the RG28XX is a well-built handheld, and I think it has some really good elements to it. The first is that I like this D-pad. It is relatively small, but it is elevated quite a bit off the shell. In addition, it has a lot of pivot, and so it almost feels like a rolling D-pad in the sense that it kind of gives you an analog stick movement. And I found this to be a great fit both for like traditional platforming games as well as arcade games too. This one is also the only handheld across this entire list that actually has HDMI video output. So if you are looking for something that you can plug into a television, this is going to be your best bet with a very small handheld. And then finally, this one also has the Allwinner H700 chipset. That's the same chip that we found in all the other Anbernic devices that have the word XX in them. And the performance here is pretty good. In fact, it's probably the most powerful among all the tiny handhelds. This does mean that you will be able to play a fair amount of Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 on it. In addition, there has been a ton of custom operating system development for this chipset, and so all the other things that you can do with the other handhelds, you can do with this one too. That means all the recent firmware updates for the other H700 devices like Miyoo OS and Newly and MinUI, they all work here as well. So you might be thinking, why with all these great things did this device not even make it into the top 5 and only an honorable mention? And bearing in mind that this is a very subjective list, after all, it's my own favorites, it really comes down to one element, and it happens to be the face buttons. Now, technically, there is nothing wrong with these buttons. They have a rubber membrane connection, and they're nice and bouncy. However, I find these buttons just to be way too small, especially in a shell that is relatively large when it comes to a smaller handheld. When you look at other devices on this list that have almost the exact same size, you can see that they have buttons that are almost twice the size altogether. And it is one of those things that just prevents me from actually wanting to use the 28XX compared to the others. There are a couple other nitpicks I have about it. For example, the display is relatively dim, all things considered, which makes it not super great for outdoor gameplay. And then also, I think that just the overall design lacks a little bit of charm, and so I don't find this to be just as attractive as the other handhelds on the list. And so when you put it all together, I think that the Anbernic RG28XX is a fine handheld. It's just not a great fit for me, but I still wanted to give it an honorable mention. Okay, so now let's talk about my 5 favorite ones, starting with number 5 and working our way up. So number 5 is going to be the GKD Pixel. This is the only device on this list that also costs over $50. Now, my favorite thing about this device is that it's made out of metal, and it is super boxy and sturdy. It has a nice retro but very premium feel as well. And in addition to the metal shell, the buttons are made out of metal as well, and so they have a nice clacky experience, and I think the controls are decent as well. I also think that it's just about a perfect size when it comes to something you can throw in your pocket, and so this is one of them that I find to be ultra portable and fun to use. And this device is capable of playing all your retro games up through the PS1 with a little bit of tinkering to make sure they run at full speed. And so those are all the good things about the GKD Pixel, and I think it is a wonderful and beautiful little handheld. However, there are some downsides to it, and I think the number one right off the bat is that this is not really an available handheld anymore. The manufacturer stopped making this device several months back, and I don't think they have plans to make any more. And so as it stands right now, to find it on AliExpress, it's going to cost at least $90, but I've even seen listings for like $125. After that, your only real option is going to be on the used market, and I think a lot of people know what they have in their hands, and so it's not going to be cheap there either. And so right off the bat, I feel like this is a device that's hard to recommend, even though it is number 5 on my list, and that is just because it's hard to find, and it kind of has become a collector's item. Now, along with the availability and the fact that I don't really play it that often because it's a collector's item, there's one other thing that I don't really like about this device either, and that is that it requires a bit of work to get running. The operating system that comes on it out of the box is kind of lousy, and so I would recommend flashing something else on it, like MinUI. I've got videos about it, including a tutorial on how to get it set up if you happen to get your hands on one. In addition, the screen on this is kind of bad until you put a screen protector on it. Once you put a screen protector on it, it's amazing. It gets really nice and reflective, and everything really pops. But it is going to cost an additional $10, $15 to get the screen protector to put on this device, so it is another layer of additional work. Either way, when even factoring in, the fact that it's hard to get your hands on, if you are able to get one of these, I think it is an amazing experience, especially especially for something that's just small and compact. It's a beautiful little handheld and just a joy to hold and use, and so that's why it ended up being number 5 on my list. So moving on, let's talk about number 4. This is going to be the TrimUI Smart, and for the longest time, this one was actually my favorite micro handheld altogether. The number one reason why I love this is because it is so comfortable. It has got a horizontal form factor, which just makes it a lot easier to hold, but it also has a rounded back to it, which makes it very comfortable as well. The rounded back also makes it super easy to slip in and out of your pocket, so that's been really great when on the go. It's also a very lightweight handheld, which makes it even more pocketable. In addition, it has wonderful controls. They're all nice and sleek and flush, again making it even more pocketable, but nice and clicky as well. This gives you really precise controls for all the games that you can play, and this also can play up to PS1 with most games being playable. So just from a pure gameplay perspective, and the fact that you have really nice controls on a comfortable handheld, this is easily one of the best on this list. However, there are a couple things about it that do give me just a little bit of pause. And the number one downside of the TrimUI Smart for me is that the screen itself feels a little bit small for its shell. You can see that it has relatively large bezels around the sides of it, but it really comes into contrast when you compare it against something like the GKD Pixel. This one also has a 2.4-inch screen, and you can see that the size difference between the two is pretty big. So ideally, I would rather have something like a 2.8-inch screen on the TrimUI Smart. I think it would just look a lot better. Another aspect of the TrimUI Smart that I wish was a little bit better are our custom firmware options. Now, we do have MIUI available for it, and that's what I use primarily, and I think it's an excellent fit all around. I think it gives you a more streamlined and easy-to-use experience compared to the stock firmware. However, one of the hallmarks of MIUI is that it is a very limited interface, and so they only really support about 15 emulators altogether. And even though the stock firmware is a worse experience, it does offer more emulators like arcade games. And so it does kind of put you in a weird position depending on the type of games you want to play. If you want to play arcade, then you're going to have to use the stock firmware, but if you're just going to be sticking to like Nintendo and Sega games, then you can play it with MIUI. And finally, the last nitpick I have about the TrimUI Smart is that it doesn't have a headphone jack. You'll have to use a USB-C adapter instead. And for me personally, I think it really expands that experience to have a headphone jack. That means you can use it like a small MP3 player as well. Okay, so those are number 5 and 4 in my favorites list, but at this point I want to take a quick pause just to kind of set the baseline. And I just want to reiterate here that even though I am saying some bad things about each of these handhelds, that's not necessarily because I think they're bad. After all, these are my favorite tiny handhelds. I personally have just learned to live with some of these nitpicks, but the reason why I'm bringing them up is because you might be interested in buying one of these, and they might be a deal breaker for you. And that's kind of the hallmark of this channel. I like to talk about both the good and the bad, and then let you make your own decision. And so that's kind of why we're going this route in the first place. Either way, I did want to make that point before we moved on to my top 3, because even though these are amazing in their own right, I'm going to have some bad things to say about them as well. So let's start with the Miyoo A30. This is a horizontal handheld that came out earlier this year. You can find it for around $40, and thanks to community software development, it just keeps getting better and better. So let's talk about the good stuff first. Number 1, I love the shape and size of this handheld. It reminds me of a smaller NES controller, but I would say it's an improvement over that older controller because it's rounded in all the right places and the buttons feel spectacular. Now, the first generation of A30 devices, like the one that I used in my initial review, that one did not have a great D-pad. However, after that first month or so, they improved it, and so I've bought a couple since then, and the controls have been excellent. They have a very nice light feel to them, and I also appreciate the fact that this device has an analog stick. I know a lot of people would rather just not have it at all, but I personally like having one of these, especially when it comes to arcade games, and this can play a fair amount of Nintendo 64 as well. And so I appreciate the fact that we have a compact and comfortable device that was also able to squeeze in an analog stick, because I do use it. In addition, this is the only device on this list that has Wi-Fi, which I think is an excellent benefit. That allows me to do things like use retro achievements, and I can even use SyncThing to sync my save states between this and other devices. And I think this is a perfect feature when it comes to a retro handheld. That means I can take it out and about with me, and then when I get home, I'll sync it with my home Wi-Fi and sync it with my other devices, and then I can resume those save games from other places. And so this device has been a seamless integration into my overall gaming circle. And if you don't know how to set up SyncThing, I made a whole guide about that as well. And as you can expect, I'm going to have it linked down below. And then finally, another great thing about the Miyoo A30 is its custom operating system, which is known as Spruce OS. This essentially is a front-end package launcher, much like with Onion OS on the Miyoo Mini, we'll talk about that later, and this one basically does the same thing, where it transforms the user experience and streamlines a lot of that process. This includes optimizations of the emulators as well as the visual aspects, including like scaling and things like that, and the team is working on a bunch of other updates that'll be coming soon, including a game switcher function. And so Spruce OS is one of those things where it really does elevate the experience of using the Miyoo A30. However, there are some nitpicks about this device, so let's dive into those. The first is that this device has a lot of heat transfer, way more than the other devices on this list. What I mean by that is that it gets pretty hot. For example, this has a relatively dim display, and so I often will play it at a 10 out of 10 brightness. And as you can expect, that adds to the overall heat transfer. In addition, the chipset itself just gets pretty warm. Even if you're playing like a Super Nintendo game, you will start to feel it warming up. And then finally, when you combine it with one of its other best features, which is the Wi-Fi chip, that gets pretty warm as well. And so when you put all three together, the Wi-Fi, the screen, as well as the CPU, it can be a pretty warm experience, even with very lightweight games. And my workaround for that is the fact that because I'm just kind of taking it around with me, I often am not playing it for long sessions. It's usually only going to be maybe 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And that seems to be the perfect amount of time to play it before that heat transfer starts to bother me. And so I've kind of found a way to make it work. Another thing worth noting is that even though Spruce OS really does improve that operating system experience, the overall operating system, including the stock one, is relatively sluggish. When you're actually just playing the device, you may not notice it, but when you're comparing it against others, it just doesn't feel as zippy. And I think that zippiness is a really important part when it comes to using a custom operating system on this device. And there are other ways to get around that. For example, MinUI, which is the operating system we were talking about with the TrimUI Smart, it also works on this device, and it is also very zippy. So it's not the end of the world, but it is another thing worth considering. If you're going to be using Spruce OS, you have to get a little bit patient and wait a beat every time you do something on the OS. And then finally, the last nitpick I have is like with the TrimUI Smart, this one does not have a headphone jack. You can use an adapter, no problem there, but I would rather just be able to plug in my 3.5 one instead. However, when you put that all together, I still think that the Miyoo A30 is one of the better small handhelds to come out this year, and at under $40, I think it's well worth it. Now, number 2 on the list is one that really surprised me, and probably not a decision I made until very recently, and it's this one here, the MagicX XU Mini M. Now, I reviewed this device a couple months back, and I was fairly positive about it, but I've grown to like it even more. Let's talk about what's good about it first. Number 1 is the fact that this thing is insanely comfortable. This thing is even more rounded than the Miyoo A30, and just is a joy to hold, all things considered. The controls are also decent, especially the more recent models. I had a launch model, which is the tan one right here, and I didn't really like the D-pad on it. However, after making that review, I bought another one, which is the orange or red color that we have now, and this one is much better. In addition, this one has dual analog sticks, and they are Hall sensor sticks, the same ones that you can find on much more expensive handhelds. And I think for a $45 handheld, having something this comfortable to use with pretty decent controls just feels like it should be a more expensive device. In addition, there are custom firmware solutions, including one called Plum OS. This is an emulation station-based front end that uses Anbernic in its back end. And it gives you a nice clean interface to navigate through, and the performance here is not bad either. You can play up to PS1 no problem, with a little bit of Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast as well. And then finally, my third favorite thing about this device is its screen. It actually has a really nice and vibrant display. Again, especially at that price point, it's pretty impressive. Now, of course, this device is not perfect, so let's talk about some of my nitpicks, and number 1 is the fact that it is a little bit thick. In fact, this is the thicker of all the devices that we have on this list. It is still a very pocketable handheld and definitely deserves to be on this list in terms of just being tiny, but it is about 10 to 15% thicker than the other ones. In addition, this device does not have Wi-Fi. You can plug in a USB Wi-Fi dongle if you need it, but I think that this would elevate the device even more because I think it's probably the one feature that it's really missing. And then finally, the last negative point I have about the XU Mini M is that just the overall rollout of this device was pretty funky. Initially, it was advertised as using a more modern Rockchip chipset, but it turned out that this was wrong. This device actually uses an RK3326 chip. That's something we've seen in a dozen other handhelds over the years. And it turns out that MagicX, the company that made this handheld, they outsource a lot of that work and the software and everything else, and it turns out that they got scammed. They thought they were getting that upgraded Rockchip chip, but no, they got the the RK3326. Now for us as users, it's actually not that big of a deal because that's a solid chip and there's a lot of custom firmware that you can use with it. Now the device is still up on AliExpress and there are plenty of options out there and they're all around $45, and I think it is still a solid handheld even if the rollout was a little bit weird. So when it comes down to it, among all of the horizontal handhelds, I found that the Mini M is actually my favorite at this point. And this is really unexpected to me. I figured that an Anbernic or a TrimUI or a Miyoo device would actually take that spot, but no, it's the MagicX XU Mini M. To put it another way, the only feature that I feel this device lacks is that Wi-Fi, because I would love to be able to use retro achievements or to be able to use it with SyncThing, things like that. But even then, it did make it to number 2 on my list, just barely edging out that Miyoo A30. So now, finally, let's talk about number 1, and drumroll here, no surprise to anyone, it is the original Miyoo Mini. This handheld has been out for almost 3 years at this point, and every time I pick it up, I just fall in love with it all over again. When talking about the things I love about it, number 1 has to be these controls. The D-pad and the face buttons just have this perfect amount of feedback and accuracy, and so I found this to be the gold standard when it comes to smaller handhelds. The buttons themselves are also super light to the touch, which means that I can just play this forever. Another really excellent factor here is Onion OS. This is also a custom front-end launcher that goes over the stock operating system, and this also keeps getting better and better. It's one of those things that's hard to articulate, but just turning on this device, navigating through the game, starting it up, and then pressing the menu button to get back to the game switcher when you're done with it, it's all just a really seamless experience. And it's a perfect combination with a small and pocketable handheld. For example, if you're playing a game and then all of a sudden you need to turn it off, you can just press and hold the power button for a couple seconds. That's going to save where you are in the game, and then the next time you start it up, it's going to go right back to where it was. Now, other operating systems can do this, including MIUI and Spruce OS, but I don't know, something about the way that Onion OS handles it just seems to be a little bit magical. And it's not often that we get this perfect symbiosis between the hardware and the software, and I think that the Miyoo Mini has really captured that. And finally, the other thing I really love about this handheld is it's just so charming. Look at it. You've got a ton of different color options to choose from, and I think they are all excellent in their own way. In addition, there are a ton of different community solutions out there as well. If you just go to Etsy and then search for Miyoo Mini, you'll find just a ton of different examples. This includes everything from stickers to buttons to cases and even grips, and so you can really stylize your device. Now, of course, there are some nitpicks here. For example, the shoulder buttons on this are not that great. I think they work just fine when it comes to using them for hotkeys, but if you were to play like a PS1 game where you needed to actually use your shoulder and trigger buttons, it's not a very fun experience. There are some improvements out there, including what they call the better buttons available on Etsy, and these will also improve that experience. Another thing I wish this device had is Wi-Fi. Unfortunately, it does not. Its bigger brother, which is the Miyoo Mini Plus with a 3.5-inch screen, that one does have it. So if you are willing to go up a little bit in size, you can find something very similar, but with Wi-Fi as well. And then finally, the other thing about the Miyoo Mini that gave me a little bit of pause is that the device is relatively fragile. Now, I've got a couple cases for it. My favorite is this one right here from Etsy, and this thing is just an amazingly slim little case. So when carrying the handheld around, I will put it inside of this case, and that usually will keep it very well protected. And even though one could make the argument that it is a little bit of a cramped experience, heck, I've made that argument myself, it's still a handheld that feels so good to use that I'll grab it anyway. And I think that's really the crux of these tiny handhelds. We're not talking about your one and done handheld, like your primary use case. We're literally talking about the thing that you can throw in your pocket, like the Miyoo Mini, and just use it when you want to. And for years, this device was so popular that Miyoo couldn't keep up. They couldn't make enough devices to actually meet demand. But thankfully, over the past several months, they finally caught up, and so it's very easy to grab one on AliExpress right now. And the pricing on here is also very good, around $45, which I think is a perfect fit for this handheld. So there you have it. When it comes to tiny handhelds, these are my favorite. And honestly, between the top 5 or 6 handhelds, each of these are great in their own way. So even though I did put one at the number 1 spot, which obviously was the Miyoo Mini, if the number 3 or the number 4 are really calling to you, I still recommend those as well. When it comes down to it, we've got a ton of different options when it comes to these that you can just throw in your pocket and have a great experience with. And like I mentioned in the beginning, these are the ones that I end up playing the most just because I happen to have them on hand. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you had to pick one of these smaller handhelds, which is the one that's the best for you? Or do you think that all these little guys are crazy and you'd rather just play on a Steam Deck? Either way, I'd love to hear what you have to say. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.